The practitioners, dear students, dear guests, it's a distinctive privilege that I have today, this morning, to welcome all of you on behalf of the academic community of the University of Bucharest at this very prestigious and important conference that you are going to have these days. I am the rector of this university, a professor of philosophy and logic at the Faculty of Philosophy of this university, and I would like very much to share with you a very few ideas and facts about this university that hosts your conference. The University of Bucharest has been established 152 years ago in 1864, and it is the second oldest university, modern university in Romania. The oldest university is in Iași, the main city in Moldova. And as you may understand very easily, when they established this university, the main goal was to modernize the Romanian society, which happily, but maybe also unfortunately, we have to say we are still doing now. We try to modernize the Romanian society in all the respects that are important for the Romanians today. And I'm very sure that what you are going to talk today is an important aspect of modernizing not only the legal theory, but also the practice, because the topic of your conference is very timely and very important from many perspectives. Today, the University of Bucharest is recognized in the country and worldwide as being the most important and successful university in Romania as far as scientific research and education is concerned. And this fact is proved recently by some rankings. For instance, in QS ranking, the University of Bucharest ranks the first in Romania and amongst the first 30 universities in this region of Europe, Eastern Europe and Central Asia. In addition to that, recently we established an institute within the University of Scientific Research, and my colleague, Vice Rector Laurențiu Leuștean, will give you some more details about that, which aims at improving and strengthening our commitment towards doing scientific research of high excellence. The University of Bucharest is also part of a consortium of 4 other Romanian universities. We call this consortium Universitaria. And the other 4 universities are the University of Babeș-Bolyai in Cluj, the university that I mentioned previously in Iași, Alexandru Ioan Cuza, university in Bucharest, which is devoted to economic studies, SIPE Bucharest, and also the West University in Timișoara. All those universities are comprehensive generalist universities. In this university, we have 19 faculties divided by main and important topics in the academic curriculum. We have natural sciences, social and political sciences, humanities. In total, we have over 32,000 students, roughly 1,500 instructors and professors, and 1,200 staff. So we are a very big community, rich in terms of wishes and ideas that we cherish very much, and I am extremely happy and proud to be the host of your very prestigious and very important and very timely conference that you are going to have today and tomorrow. I would like to thank very much and to congratulate the organizers of this conference and to wish all of you a good conference, fruitful discussions, and a pleasant and nice stay in Bucharest. Thank you very much. So since I actually had the floor first, allow me now to introduce our distinguished guest, Julia Iliopoulos-Strangas, who is going to give a short speech as an introductory address.
Liebe Mitglieder der SIPE, dear members.
Dear friends and colleagues, it is a pleasure to welcome you in this Congress of SIPE, SIPE, hosted in Bucharest after the Congress of establishing our society 12 years ago in the island of Crete, and after all the other towns that hosted our congresses. We are now in Bucharest, an important town, a city found at the crossroads of important trade routes, and the capital of Romania since 1859. Given that in Romanian Bucuria means joy, so that makes Bucharest the city of joy, allow me to express my joy and happiness to host you all here. Allow me now to make a few remarks on the topic of this society, of this conference. Our society, as usual, has picked a very topical issue, something that is prone to share the interest of experts coming from different countries. The supranational law of the European Union must be also considered, as usual. Migration is a new challenge that the states and organizations must cope with. I will not dwell on this topic very long, because it is not my intention to replace what my colleague will present in the introductive report. Speaking of today's world, we can see that poverty makes people leave their country and go to Europe. Often it is difficult to make the difference between migrants and refugees, but this difference is important for the legal status of these people. It is also decisive. However, the burden that has to be shouldered by the member states placed at the frontier of the Union is heavier than for others. And we can't address that only by the effort of these countries found at the border. Migration in Europe is multiple, and it's made up of several aspects: national law, international law, the law of the peoples, and they all contain regulations that take a toll on the migrants, preventing them sometimes to enter part of the countries. From a different point of view, with the migration flow, we can see the rise of important issues in the field of protection. First of all, the protection of migrants. But we can also speak of protection when it comes to the protection of the native population, especially when we speak about uncontrolled and illegal migration, putting at risk national security. Of course, our conference cannot bring an exhaustive solution to all these issues.
The questions that we will deal with in the next 2 days. I will not try to provide you with any answer, however provisional it may be. The fact that the immigration has been among the key considerations that led to the referendum's call in Great Britain and the basic reason behind Brexit outcome illustrates the significance of these issues for the future of the European Union itself. At this point, I will limit myself to extend my sincerest and warmest thanks to all prominent experts on this theme, namely to our speakers who accepted the difficult task to try to provide you with any answer. The main proceedings of the Congress have been proceeded yesterday by the workshop of junior scholars who raised striking perspectives on different aspects of the general discourse and could thus bring fresh ideas. Before concluding the welcome address, and also on behalf of the SIPE Executive Committee, let me extend our warmest thanks to the European Commissioner for Migration, Home Affairs and Citizenship, Mr. Avramopoulos, who has extended his patronage to our Congress. He cannot be with us today because he has to be in Slovenian. And I am deeply grateful to Professor Elena Simina Tănăsescu and the team of her collaborators for their extraordinary work over the last year in organizing this Congress. Meine Damen und Herren, wir freuen uns somit auf instruktive...
Doamnelor și domnilor, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I would like to wish all of you and all of us a fruitful conference, and why not a few pleasant hours spent in the beautiful city of Bucharest.
On behalf of my Executive Committee colleagues as well, I wish you all a successful conference, but also a pleasant time in the beautiful city of Bucharest. Mesdames et messieurs, nous nous réjouissons d'avance des interventions instructives et des discussions stimulantes qui suivront.
I hope that you will spend a nice time in Bucharest, and also that you will find this event very interesting.
Thank you very much, Mrs. President. Yeah. Thank you for your kind words about the city of Bucharest. I never thought of my city as being the city of joy, but yeah, you're right. It's the city of joy sometimes. And also thank you for highlighting some of the key issues that we are going to discuss in your conference. Allow now me to introduce to you Professor Tsilea, who is going to say a few words on behalf of the EU Commissioner Dimitris Avramopoulos.
Secretary General of the SIPE.
Secretary General of your organization, SIPE.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Liebe Kollegen.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, the brief letter addressed to you by Commissioner Avramopoulos will be...
The entire College of Commissioners is meeting today for the first day of the Slovak presidency in Bratislava. As European Commissioner for Migration, Home Affairs and Citizenship, I'm very happy of your initiative, and I give my full support to your Congress. I think your academic society has a very important contribution to bring to the current debates that are so important for the future of the European Union, and I wish you a full success for your discussion. Signed, Dimitris Avramopoulos.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. The last speech in this introductory section is going to be delivered and addressed to you by Professor Laurențiu Leuștean, who is a Vice Rector of this University for Scientific Research. Professor Leuștean, you have the floor.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, in my capacity of Vice Rector in charge of scientific research in the University of Bucharest, I am most pleased to welcome you here. I would also like to convey the same message as the rector of our university, Professor Mircea Dumitru, and tell you that we are proud to host the 11th Congress of the Societăți Juris Publice Europei. This is yet another proof of the internationalization of higher education and of the need for cooperation and networking among researchers. I am happy to inform you that the two Institutes for Advanced Studies and Research of the University of Bucharest, namely ICUB, the newly established Institute for Research of our university, and Serefrea Villanoel have congregated for this event to take place here and now. Since we are a rather classical academic institution with faculty specialized in humanities, social sciences and natural sciences, we tend to be well aware of the difficulties encountered by humanities and social sciences in a globalized scientific world. That is why we are proud to host today such a high-level and transdisciplinary scientific gathering, which targets a most significant issue for broad communities of people all over the world, namely migration. Even mathematicians such as myself know about and have actually benefited of the possibilities offered by legal migration, as I was a lecturer for almost 6 years in Germany. At the same time, mass media informs us on a regular basis about the problems and complications which accompany illegal migration. One does not need to be a lawyer to understand such matters, and yet it seems there is still a lot of substance for debate on the topic, as the following days will surely demonstrate. The University of Bucharest is delighted to be able to offer the institutional framework for such a debate, and is most interested to see its concrete results, namely the publication of its proceedings. Allow me to wish you every success in your future endeavors and a productive meeting over the coming days. Thank you.
Here we end the ceremony and introductory talks. May I wish you again, all of you, successful discussions, and I hope that this will not be the last time that we are going to meet in Bucharest, in particular in this university. Enjoy.
Dear colleagues, chers collègues, liebe Kollegen,
Dear colleagues,
the first session, challenges for migration and migration law in Europe. We have chosen this topic for our Congress 2 years ago, 2014, and it was like a providence that now it is exact in time, and I would say also in time and in the right place, here to discuss this question. And of course, now we will start in the first part of our panel with the identifying of the topics which are the challenges for the migration and migration law in Europe. And then we will, in the second part of our panel, we will continue with identifying of some solutions. But first, I would like to give the floor to Professor Tim and then to Professor Farge.
Okay,
Yeah?
that's okay.
Farge, Professor Farge, to identify the new challenges for the migration law in Europe. First, Professor Tim from University of Constance.
Many thanks for the kind introduction, and I'll follow the example of the rector and stand up so that you can see me better. It's an honor to be the first speaker, and I must congratulate the organizers for an ambitious program. Most of us have been asked not to discuss so much the technical detail, but rather overarching themes. And that's quite unusual because most conferences on migration which I attend focus on the detail. I will do the same with a contribution scrutinizing the challenges to the law at a more abstract level, and I'll focus on the European Union. More specifically, I will combine the specificities of refugee and asylum law with a more general reflection on the constitutional malaise of the EU. And this approach, combining the specificities of immigration and asylum with a general reflection on EU law, may be particularly productive when we try to rationalize the sense of panic and crisis the arrival of more than 1 million refugees brought about in many national capitals and in Brussels. Why? To combine the specialized domain of migration and asylum with general EU affairs allows me to reconstruct the refugee crisis as a problem not so much of protecting refugees, but rather as a crisis of the law, or to be more precise, as a crisis of the supranational integration method. And in line with the handout which you might have received, I will develop my argument in 4 steps. Firstly, the international legal context. Secondly, structural deficiencies of the common European asylum system. Thirdly, constitutional challenges in terms of legal design. And finally, questions of institutional legitimacy. And the essence of the argument I'm going to make will be that the supranational integration method does not necessarily support the success of EU asylum policy, unfortunately. Let me start with the international legal context. Most of you will know that the principle of non-refoulement is the cornerstone of refugee law. It obliges states not to return anyone to a territory where she would be persecuted for one of the reasons set out in the Refugee Convention. It is beyond doubt that the EU must respect this rule, and yet the implications for the design of asylum policies are far from certain. And this uncertainty stems from the territorial substructure of the international refugee regime, since the prohibition of refoulement takes effect only once a person reaches the territory of a state. It may sound cynical, but there is no guarantee that a refugee can travel freely and safely to a destination of her choice. States retain a principled discretion whether to establish legal avenues for entry, such as resettlement programs. In Europe, arrivals at the borders are much more important than resettlement programs anyway, and at the border, another aspect takes center stage. While refugees may seek protection, may apply for asylum in any country, states retain authority to refer asylum seekers elsewhere. The guarantee of non-refoulement does not embrace a right to choose the place where one is protected against refoulement. And corresponding rules on safe third countries became popular instruments of indirect migration control from the 1980s onwards, and they highlight an important gap in the international regime. The Geneva Convention stays largely silent on interstate cooperation, and as a result, this interstate cooperation remains based on ad hoc solutions and is often dominated by state interests, as the arrangements between the EU and Turkey amply illustrate. And on this basis, we can identify 2 important strands of any debate about the EU's asylum policy at this juncture. We may adopt, firstly, a policy perspective and analyze the measures adopted by the EU institutions. And secondly, we can investigate the legal framework at a more abstract level and try to analyze whether interstate cooperation is successful. And my paper and my presentation today focus on the second dimension, and this more institutional abstract inquiry is important precisely because the Geneva Convention does not mandate a specific policy design. And indeed, it was and is the promise of the so-called common European asylum system to fill this void. And the EU has adopted a remarkable collection of secondary laws which, taken together, cover several hundred pages in the official journal. Yet this massive amount of legislative activity could not prevent a sense of crisis unfolding in recent months, and I want to understand the reasons why that happened. I want to understand why the law, these several hundred pages, failed to deliver. And let me move on this basis to my second section on structural deficiencies of the common European asylum system. In the written version of my presentation, which you do not have, I give an overview of the practical shortcomings at the internal and external borders by highlighting, amongst other things, the systemic flaws in the asylum systems of countries like Greece or the widespread irrelevance of the Dublin regulation. Most of you will be familiar with these shortcomings through media reports, and they can be summarized in a simple expression which became a standard reference, the so-called Western Balkans route, along which almost 1 million people moved northward last year. And it seems to me that these difficulties, which I cannot describe in more detail, that these difficulties transcend simple phenomena of disrespect for European law, since they epitomize rather structural deficiencies at the heart of the common European asylum system. And these deficiencies concern both questions of legal design and compliance, mirroring, by the way, similar design and compliance deficits in monetary union. There are several explanations for this very unfortunate state of affairs, and the identification of these underlying reasons may ideally help us to identify the direction in which reform efforts should be piloted. And let me briefly explain 6 structural reasons for the deficiencies which we can identify. Firstly, it is well known that the rules on asylum jurisdiction in the Dublin regulation are lopsided. They would operate to the disadvantage to state at the external borders if they were ever applied rigorously. Greece and Italy had little incentives to comply with the Dublin regulation. Secondly, there are states in the European Union which do not have much experience as asylum destination countries. And it seems, moreover, that some of these states do not have either the administrative capacities nor the political will to establish functioning domestic asylum systems. Thirdly, there are generic limits to what migration control by states can achieve in practice. States have an impact on the volume and direction of flows, as the closure of the Western Balkan routes and arrangements between the EU and Turkey demonstrate, but the impact is bound to remain relative and context-specific. States will never exercise full control. It's not enough, therefore, to rely upon reactive law enforcement alone if the EU wants to guarantee compliance. I'll come back to that with regard to the reform of the Dublin regulation in a minute. Fourthly, the common European asylum system presents itself as a sort of fair weather construction. A bit like monetary union, it is based on unrealistic assumptions. It was designed at a time when decreasing numbers of asylum applications left the impression that effective protection is best guaranteed by very complex procedures. Events over the past year have shown that this can be the wrong approach. It can be problematic, therefore, that secondary law is difficult to amend in practice. But it's not only the contents of the law which explains the crisis. The EU is also confronted, fifthly, with what I call an ideational dilemma, since the supranational institutions have traditionally perceived themselves as an avant-garde abolishing borders instead of resurrecting them. The EU has to learn how to channel conflicting impulses for open or closed borders into political disputes. I shall come back to this at the end. Finally, the EU establishes a common area of protection on paper only. There are multiple differences between the domestic asylum system in terms of standards of protection and regarding economic attractiveness. As a result, most refugees do not want to seek protection in Europe. They want to go to a specific country, Sweden, Austria, or Germany. And that was a rough and very brief overview of the structural deficiencies. And let me move on this basis to the constitutional analysis. At a meeting with plenty of law professors, I don't have to explain at length that the EU relies much more than the nation state on the binding force of legal rules, while political mechanisms for conflict resolution are less developed. And that is the famous dual character of supranationalism identified by Joseph Weiler more than 20 years ago. On this basis, we can identify a double challenge with which both the refugee crisis and the euro crisis brought to the surface. One challenge is of legal design and compliance, the other of institutional legitimacy or political decision-making. And I will consider both these challenges and emphasize, in doing so, similarities and discrepancies between the dual crisis of refugee law and monetary union. First, legal design and compliance. It's widely acknowledged that the success of legal supranationalism rests on a combination of factors such as direct effect, preliminary references, and infringement proceedings. And these instruments for law enforcement were developed for the internal market and related policy fields, and they continue to function reasonably well in these areas. It seems to me, however, that they cannot sustain the success of the common European asylum system in a similar way. And the reason is simple: there are structural differences. What I mean with structural differences is explained best in relation to the doctrine of direct effect, which in the single market famously empowered the individual to serve as a guardian for the implementation of European rules via domestic court. It's evident, however, that this trajectory can support the effectiveness of asylum policy only insofar as European rules protect the individual. By contrast, it does not buttress rules which neither individuals nor member states will find particularly attractive. Refugees who want to seek protection in Sweden will not complain against the Hungarian authorities not complying with the Dublin regulation. It may be no coincidence, therefore, that the Court of Justice has pursued, until recently at least, a strict line towards the recognition of individual rights in the Dublin regulation, thereby minimizing opportunities for complaints. And one side effect of this approach is well known among the experts of EU law: the lingering dispute between the European Court of Justice and the ECHR regarding Dublin procedures, which featured prominently in the list of arguments why the EU cannot accede to the ECHR. And if my argument is correct, we can conclude at a more abstract level of analysis that there is no uniform model of legal supranationalism. We are confronted rather with variations on the prototype of the single market model, and while some of these variations are provisional and disappear over time, others are permanent. And such permanent variations usually react to distinct features of the policy field in question. Legal supranationalism has many faces, and understanding what is specific to asylum policy may help us to understand the reason why the common European asylum system failed, thereby also identifying possible ways how to overcome the crisis. And what then are the specificities of asylum and border control policies? As mentioned earlier, they cannot always rely on the individual and courts as a guardian for law enforcement. Moreover, I contend that they are defined by an enhanced operational character. And what do I mean by this operational character? Asylum and border control policies habitually involve the application of EU rules to numerous individuals in literally thousands of cases, which are often decided by officials with a relatively low degree of formal education. And anyone reading a newspaper these days learns what that means in practice. Last summer, the European Union famously promised to relocate 160,000 asylum seekers from Italy and Greece. 2 weeks ago, the Commission informed us that 2,280 people, or no more than 1.5%, have been relocated so far. The media also tells us that the so-called hotspots in Greece are confronted with protracted difficulties. The Asylum Office EASO and the Borders Agency Frontex launched calls for more than 2,500 asylum officers, policemen, interpreters, and judges to be sent to the Greek islands from across the Union. Much less people have arrived there in practice, and anecdotal evidence suggests that there are massive difficulties in terms of transnational cooperation on the ground. And this has practical implications for our topic. Why? In policy fields such as banking, chemicals, or telecommunication, in which some of you may be involved academically, the Commission and specialized regulatory agencies at European level have managed to establish effective network oversight in areas defined, crucially, by a high level of expert knowledge. This model cannot be replicated in asylum and border control policies. However, why governance structures differ, EU policy should take account of the enhanced operational character described a minute ago. And it seems to me that the Commission proposals on the reform of both the Asylum Office EASO and Frontex, on which the Parliament and the Council agreed 2 weeks ago, are a step in the right direction. They respond to the specificities and may thereby help overcoming the crisis, but success is not guaranteed. And one reason for the uncertain success is the continued confederal setup of these agencies. To be sure, new labels, as proposed by the Commission, signal an enhanced level of ambition. Frontex, for instance, will be replaced by nothing less than, quote, a European Border and Coast Guard, and a future, quote, European Union Agency for Asylum is meant to substitute the present support office in Malta. We should be careful, however, not to confuse these ambitious new labels with conceptual about-turns. The reforms put forward by the Commission does not involve fully fledged federalization. National asylum and border control systems will remain separate. The reformed agencies will be endowed rather with enhanced coordination and supervisory powers. One specific example. The hallmark of the future European Border and Coast Guard, replacing Frontex, concerns a right to intervene on the ground in cases of persisting deficits, if necessary, against the will of the member state concerned. More regulatory muscle does not necessarily translate into success on the ground, however, as we learned with the Stability and Growth Pact. To be sure, to be successful, the new Border and Coast Guard will have to muster sufficient political clout and managerial expertise to remedy the shortcomings of domestic systems on the ground. That may succeed, but it needn't. The EU institutions have no successful track record in reforming national administrations. It might turn out, therefore, that the reinforced agencies are faced with exactly the same problems which have marred the success of the CEAS in the past. And a similar conclusion can be defended for the reform of the Dublin regulation put forward by the Commission in early May. Generally speaking, the Commission is, of course, right to reform the Dublin system, since it's the Dublin regulation that connects national asylum systems, and without a functioning mechanism for horizontal cooperation, the European asylum system may quite simply fall apart sooner or later. Will the Dublin proposal prevent the European asylum system from unraveling? Well, that's difficult to say. To be sure, the Commission reacts to several of the structural deficiencies described earlier, but it stops short of a radical about-turn, and that may very well be for political reasons, since anything else would not have survived the legislative process anyway. And what then does the Commission propose? Firstly, it seeks to tackle the lack of interstate solidarity through a so-called corrective mechanism, which shall be triggered automatically whenever the number of asylum applications in a certain member state surpasses a predefined threshold. And this prospect of quasi-automatic solidarity may ideally increase the willingness of states like Italy and Greece to apply supranational rules. Secondly, the Dublin system has relied so far on a highly complex and reactive surrender procedure, which turned out to be a fair weather construction. It doesn't work in practice. The Commission responds to this widespread failure by streamlining surrender procedures and by perpetuating the outcome of the initial allocation of jurisdiction. The failure of a take-back request under the Dublin regulation will, in contrast to the present legal situation, no longer entail a transfer of responsibility to the member state where the refugee is located. They are instead expected to return to the member state responsible. If not, they don't get an asylum procedure. Thirdly, the Dublin regulation has always been criticized for not giving asylum seekers incentives for compliance, and the proposal takes up this criticism, but it does so controversially through negative incentives against secondary movements, including a sharp reduction in social benefits in member states not responsible. And this may reduce secondary movements somewhat, although the phenomenon will most probably continue, since the proposal cannot unmake persisting differences in terms of reception conditions and broader economic attractiveness described earlier. And like in the case of the reformed agencies, it cannot be guaranteed, therefore, that all legal design and compliance deficits will be remedied. I'm happy to come back to all that in the discussion, but given time constraints, I will move on to my very last section on institutional legitimacy. And as mentioned earlier, supranationalism famously combines an enhanced degree of legal integration with limited political integration. And I'll focus on this political aspect now. And on this basis, we can identify another similarity between the refugee crisis and the Euro crisis. They both required quick political reactions and tested the stability of the institutional balance. We could observe a sequence of intergovernmental meetings with Germany as a core player in both cases. At the same time, however, there are important differences between the Euro and the refugee crisis, and it seems to me that these differences might facilitate the response to the refugee crisis in the medium run. A first divergence concerns the scope of union competences, which allows the EU institution to move towards a more integrated asylum system within the supranational treaty framework. There was and is no need to revert to international satellite treaties following the example of the ESM or the Fiscal Compact. This entailed a more proactive role of the supranational institutions, the Commission in particular. In the long run, another difference could prove crucial. The foundations of institutional legitimacy from which supranational decision-making can draw remains largely intact insofar as asylum and border controls are concerned. And this hypothesis is explained best by a comparison with monetary union. A widespread constitutional criticism of the European policy response to the Euro crisis concerns redistributive effects. EU policies in response to the Euro crisis intervene into social conflicts about salient issues, money, social benefits, even though the EU institutions are ill-equipped to articulate corresponding conflicts, since they were primarily set up to mitigate conflicts between states. And if that is correct, the most significant long-term challenge posed by the Euro crisis concerns the legitimacy of decision-making. The EU cannot take up the challenges which it has to face. By contrast, border control and asylum policies have few direct redistributive effects, and they do not necessarily affect issues that are salient in the democratic context. Most anti-immigration sentiment does not relate directly to EU policies, to technical EU issues such as entry controls, asylum jurisdiction, or residence permit renewal. Voters are concerned rather with what they perceive, rightly or wrongly, as the effects of immigration for social cohesion or the labor market. Moreover, immigration often serves as a projection sphere for wider unease. It may be crucial, therefore, that substantive EU immigration and asylum law leaves member state wide discretion in areas such as labor market access, language skills, the status of religious groups, or the structure of the welfare states. Thus, the EU might, in contrast to the euro crisis, possibly circumvent the pitfalls of controversial decision-making on immigration-related topics precisely because it limits itself to lay down the framework for national decision-making on salient issues. And this conclusion need not necessarily, at least, be contradicted by the resurgence of populist parties across Europe, which the refugee crisis quite obviously seems to have reinforced, as the presidential elections in Austria show in the same way as the Brexit referendum. Why? This sensitivity might have been the result of the effective breakdown of the European asylum system along the Western Balkans route. If the EU managed to overcome the structural deficiencies of its asylum system, it could possibly return to a more quiet mode of decision-making. And in the field of asylum, this would presuppose, however, that governments and citizens can agree on an overlapping consensus that refugees should be protected in Europe or elsewhere, and that the EU should assume some responsibility in this respect. This would be a return to the good old days of a permissive consensus supporting EU decision-making. And this leaves us with a very final query: how to reach an overlapping consensus on asylum which might sustain effective decision-making at European level. Events over the past months have shown that at the moment it doesn't exist. Member states and citizens disagree quite fundamentally about the direction in which the EU should move. It's sometimes said that, well, that's a non-issue in a way, because the EU treaties resolve the problem. They establish the basis for an underlying consensus. That's what some of my colleagues say. And they stipulate that Article 78 TFEU mandates full compliance with the Geneva Convention. But as I described at the outset, that doesn't resolve our problem because the Geneva Convention doesn't mandate a specific policy design. The EU treaty doesn't therefore replace the need to establish a foundational consensus how to structure the European asylum system. And for the CEAS, the Common European Asylum System, the current scenario therefore presents a sort of constitutional moment in which conceptual foundations are being exposed and reconfigured in line, by the way, if I'm not wrong, with the original Greek meaning of the term crisis, which can refer, among others, to a turning point or decision. And it is in the nature of such a fundamental realignment that the outcome is not predetermined. It is uncertain whether a new foundational consensus will be developed and how it could look like. And what role will the EU institutions play in that debate? It seems to me that they could, in principle, play a very constructive role. Why? Because they have traditionally been quite good at establishing interstate consensus, while they have been quite bad in discussing issues which are salient in the democratic context. This presupposes, however, that the EU can circumvent the pitfalls of controversial decision-making in line with my earlier comments. If that was not the case, if EU migration law continued to be highly contested in the member states and in public debates, asylum policy at European level would be complicated indefinitely. And this leaves me with a very final remark, which designates a core challenge of EU integration at this juncture: increasing popular contestation, which is reinforced but not limited to the resurgence of populist parties across Europe. For many years, both EU integration in general and asylum policy more specifically were by and large shielded from extensive popular scrutiny, thereby allowing governments, elites, and the supranational institution to advance moderately liberal policies. And that may, but it may no longer be possible. One feature of the populist style of argumentations are attacks against the elite and the symbolic recourse to the supposedly homogeneous will of the people. And migration is a classic theme to express this message, as is the European Union. Migration, it may present too much of a temptation, therefore, to bring supranational migration policies into the limelight of domestic debates, mirroring the Brexit referendum or the forthcoming Hungarian referendum on mandatory refugee relocation. If that were the case, if EU asylum policy was engulfed in heavy political disputes at national level, a return to the good old days of EU integration was not an option. Even technical legislation on border controls and asylum would be subject to intense politicization in the future, and a new foundational consensus on asylum could develop around the need for restrictive policies at best. There is clear empirical evidence that migration policies tend to become more restrictive once a populist party becomes active at national level. That's it. My time is up, I guess. Let me summarize by means of conclusion that we are confronted indeed with a challenge to the law, as the organizers suggested. I would even argue that it is more than a challenge. The refugee crisis unmasked structural deficiencies at the heart of the CEAS, in a similar way as the Euro crisis showed structural deficiencies in the construction of monetary union. And these deficits concern both legal design and compliance and the wider constitutional political context, since the nature of asylum policy might quite simply not sustain quiet decision-making at European level, which arguably is necessary for the EU to agree on the legislative changes which would be necessary to at least to overcome at least some of these structural deficiencies which I've tried to identify. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tim, for this very instructive introduction to our topic. As lawyers, we are starting with law. It's should be, but each law refers to the politics and the policy behind the law, and especially immigration and asylum law cannot be analyzed without reference to the asylum politics and asylum and migration politics, and you have already expressed this interconnection. Therefore, we will continue with rather non-legal topic on the general challenges for the Europe, which is created by the migration and asylum seekers flow to Europe. And I would say, you said 1 million in 1 year. We have 500 million inhabitants. It's 0.2% of whole European citizens, I would say. From the point of view of quantity, I would say it's maybe manageable. If we could imagine that Turkey has 2.5 million asylum seekers and other third world countries much more. But anyway, our asylum law and also migration law is created for a certain, you say, Sonnenschein times, yeah, good weather times, and now we have not so good weather, and therefore we should also think about on how to change the politics and policy in order to manage this crisis. And I will give the floor to Professor Fag from Florence to introduce us in this field. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, everybody. I think I will shift to French because diversity makes beauty, as we say in French. Donc je vais m'exprimer en français. Je voudrais d'abord remercier la Société européenne de droit public pour avoir
I would like to thank the European Society for Civil Law, which has invited someone who is not a member of this society and doesn't even belong to this discipline. I'm a demographic specialist, and I will focus on numbers, trying to outline the context, the background against which migration has become a challenge for Europe. And we will try to find some solutions to this problem. I will start by asking myself one question. What do these challenges consist in? Let's focus on the migration crisis and on the demographic crisis, which is being anticipated in Europe. Everyone knows it, but no one is actually speaking about it. Then the climate change should also be tackled. I had a PowerPoint presentation, but I no longer have the time to show the slides. I only have 20 minutes allocated for my presentation. In my PowerPoint presentation, I was speaking about the Brit leader of the Brexit campaign, who used to speak about the challenges we are exposed to. And I don't understand the accusations or the allegations regarding Nazist propaganda. This is an unprecedented crisis. When we say unprecedented crisis, we need to analyze it from a historic and geographical point of view. 1 million refugees or asylum seekers per year in Europe do not represent a high number if we compare this number to what happened after the Second World War, when we spoke about 60 million people. Europe is not an island. It is connected to the rest of the world. And it's normal to compare this number to other numbers. 3.5 million people. This is the number of refugees that Iran had to receive because of the war taking place in a neighboring country. A war in which Russia, the United States were also involved. I think we should keep in mind that there are many other crises just as important as this one in quantitative terms. I won't refer to the boat people in Vietnam in the 60s, and so on and so forth. If we take a look at the numbers that are published by the UNHCR, we will see that the number has increased, but directly in direct proportion with the population of the world. People who were forced to abandon their homes are not all considered refugees. So we are not actually faced with refugee invasion, as the Brexit supporters say. Actually, we are faced with some people that are forced to migrate in order to receive international protection. Let's see the typical elements of today's crisis. First of all, the global character of this crisis. Some 2 months ago, you must have read in the newspapers that some borders between states were closed in order to put an end to the refugees' flow. I'm speaking about Panama and its border to Colombia, so that the refugees coming from Colombia couldn't get into Panama. Another aspect of this global crisis, if we think about the migrants that are trying to flee what is going on in Iraq or Syria, you will notice that not all of them have reached the Balkans area. Many of them were rejected and had to Australia, for instance, where they went by boat. Actually, it wasn't about Australia, it was about Indonesia as a destination point. So migration is a worldwide phenomenon. We have a contrary situation. Refugees coming from a wide array of destinations. For instance, Lesbos island has received in 2015 a high number of refugees of different nationalities. Migration is obviously a global phenomenon, and it cannot be managed at global level. And that is because there is no international law for migration. There is international law for refugees, but there are no national legislations for migration in order to manage this phenomenon. Maybe after the following meeting of the UNO taking place this autumn, there will be one. We have more than 1 million asylum seekers in Europe. This was the number in 2015. The number has decreased a bit, but it is still high. It's a relative number, however. The chairperson made a comparison with the European population of 500 million people. The number of the new migrants forced to flee their countries because of the conflict should be taken into account. For instance, the conflict in Syria. What we see in the media makes us ask some questions. I will ask two such questions. What is the nature of this crisis? Is it a refugee crisis or a migrant crisis, as some leaders in Europe would like to make us believe? The answer to this question, and I'm relying on statistical information, is that the distribution by nationalities of people coming to Greece and Italy in the past 5 years, so this distribution by nationalities of asylum seekers receiving a positive answer in Europe, it proves undoubtedly that we have shifted from their coming by sea, which was an economic migration, to a migration of refugees. There is no doubt about it. In 2010, 35%, we had 35% of refugees, and in the last few years, in the last 2 years, 80%. So we are dealing with people requiring international protection, not with people that are trying to take advantage of our asylum systems in order to find jobs. This is pure propaganda. The second question, what has triggered this crisis? The German Chancellor, Ms. Merkel, has received migrants with open arms. Has received the refugees with open arms. I will try to get out of the European paradigm box, because we're used to scrutinizing issues from a European perspective. What is going on is a set of conflicts in Iraq and Syria, These are states that have fallen apart. Libya is another example. Despite the European intervention, and we should think about our future. What does the future hold in store for us here in Europe? Taking into account the migration phenomenon, I will focus on the fact that the migration will not stop. This is the first element, because the root is to be found in their countries of origin, where dictatorships are present, and those countries are falling apart. The second element, we should think that those migrants we want to keep in the first asylum countries cannot stay there, in the country where they submitted their requests, for example, Jordan or Turkey. Some of these countries are not part of the Geneva Convention or the Convention in 67. In these countries, refugees were received with open arms, but just as guests, just as someone invites us to go to dinner. If you impose on the host's courtesy and want to spend your night there, you may no longer be welcome. There is a humanitarian approach, but there is no refugee status. Once the visa expires, the person has to abandon the territory of that country. Otherwise, he or she will be illegal in that country. And this illegal status is entailing terrible consequences. We've seen what is going on in the refugees camps in Liban.
En deçà de nos critères.
In Liban. And this goes beyond our European criteria. Then we should see what is happening in the neighboring area. The situation is deteriorating. The refugees situation is also deteriorating. The massive flows of refugees coming from Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Turkey have exerted significant pressure, economic pressure, but other kinds of pressure too. For instance, social and political pressure. It is also very high because we keep on imagining that the world is divided into states, into nations, and everyone has a flag and clear-cut frontiers, borders. This is not the case in this part of the world. If a Syrian is going to Lebanon, he will seek refuge in his national community, and that will lead to imbalances in Lebanon, which may make Lebanon another country that will fall apart in that region. So refugees are going to countries where there are already other refugees. And according to the definition provided by the United Nations, more refugees, increasing the number of an already existing refugee community, is making the situation more difficult. This leads to Kurdish extremism in Iraq and Turkey, for instance. When we force our neighbors because Turkey is a country that has applied for its membership to the UN. So we are forcing now. We're forcing Turkey to take decisions that may affect their own security. Now let's focus on the demographic aspect. At first, Europe was divided. Then some of the countries opened their arms. Some other countries built walls or barbed wire fences. Currently, there is a sort of consensus focusing on putting an end to the migration routes to Europe. In the eastern Mediterranean area, an agreement was signed with Turkey, and I have a nice graph in my presentation. Turkey observed the agreement signed in 2016. The number of migrants per day has almost disappeared. Before signing these agreements, we spoke about 2,000 migrants per day. Nowadays, we're speaking about a few migrants a day. What will happen in the future? How did Turkey manage to put an end to this migration flow? How does it relate to Article 13 of the Declaration of Fundamental Human Rights? Europe is closing its eyes, if we come to think about it. Another area where Europe stepped in was the central Mediterranean area, the route from Sicily to Italy. After the Berlusconi government, Italy made some decisions that led to many people being saved. There is a European intervention action by sea close to the Libyan coasts. We have seen the agreement signed by the United Nations. The routes in the Mediterranean area have been opened again. The number of dead people in the area of Sicily has soared again. We all know these things. Also in the central Mediterranean area, actions are focusing on eradicating those traffickers helping migrants cross the sea. They are providing some services that do not actually exist, because refugees willing to pay in order to get to Europe cannot benefit from the services provided by an air company because they have no visa. There are two options. We could keep on closing our eyes, or keeping our eyes closed, or stop the actions of these people. I'm not speaking about the refoulement. The Libyan situation is quite complicated. We could resort to some asylum visas in the embassies in countries in the Middle East, for instance. Maybe such visas, asylum visas for humanitarian reasons, should be issued. And it would help us put an end to these dangerous crossings of the Mediterranean and put an end to the terrorist activity. I've begun my presentation 12 minutes ago. I would like to proceed to the last topic I wanted to tackle. The European Commission issued a communique on June the 17th. It was sent to the European institutions in order to establish comprehensive partnerships with the transit and origin countries of migrants. Just a few words, and then I will give you the floor. Please read this communique. Read it in your capacity as a jurist, but also in your capacity as a simple reader. Because there are two concepts highlighted in this communique. The going back, the refoulement of illegal migrants. This is the first one. And the second one, migrants and refugees should be as closest as possible to their origin countries or origin areas. More for more and less for less is a typical English expression. Among the countries, this agreement is referring to 16 countries, among which Eritrea, Sudan. One of these countries ranks the first as a country of origin. This is Afghanistan. Then we have three countries which have the worst dictatorships in Africa. Keeping these migrants means deviating from the European legislation. If we think about the principle of help for development, it was designed especially in order to help those people who need this help, not to fulfill Europe's interest, to meet Europe's interest. There are some European institutions that fell victims to the populism in certain countries. I think the migration will not stop, unfortunately. And in order to draw some conclusions, I would like to say one thing. We are dealing with a legal void. The legal approach of migration issues in Europe is not possible. If we think that Europe is operating in a world where there are no universal principles regulating migration, on the occasion of the next General Assembly of the UNO, I hope the UNO will put on the agenda these universal principles as a topic. The construction of migration law, just as we have a specific refugee international law. I will give you one figure. If we were to put an end to migration today, as many of our politicians would like, until 2035, namely in the following 19 years, the population aged between 20 and 44 years old, the most important on the labor market, the one Europe is relying on in order to have a knowledge-based economy. So this age group will decrease by 33 million people if we were to put an end to migration today. That would be a decrease by 25%. No one dares to say such things, to say that we do need migrants. No one has the courage to carry out scrutiny that would counter populism. Populists say that migrants are the ones taking the jobs from the nationals. We should push these answers forward, because demographic figures are crystal clear. When we speak about this age group between 20 and 44 years old, it shows us that things are obvious. Until the following elections, the next elections, radical changes will not take place. Changes will happen in time. And we should consider a secure future in the long run, but which is not visible in the short run. These are the issues we should focus on as citizens. Now I will pass the floor to the following speaker. Thank you.
Thank you for showing us the real face of the problem. We still have a few minutes to discuss. But allow me a few remarks before that. Europe is part of the global refugee problem, on the margin of the global refugee problem. But there is a difference compared to other regions of the world. Our goal is to integrate the refugees in Europe, which means that they must stay on the long term and help them reach the mainstream level of society. Things will be different in Iraq, in Turkey, or Jordan. There, the refugees are given the right to temporary asylum, a right of temporary stay, on the condition that they go back to their countries of origin. As Jordan, for instance, does, though there the situation is a bit different. But we are in a different situation, and our law is based on the integration of refugees, and that makes the basic difference. And now I open the floor to questions. So you are the first. Thank you.
These two lectures were very interesting and at the same time very challenging. And I would like to point a problem that you didn't focus, and in my opinion that's the most important problem when you look at the situation in Europe. When we look at the situation from the law point of view, we normally just speak about secondary EU law. That's what you've made, and then you added something about legitimacy. But I think the problem is also from the point of view of constitutional European law, since the right of asylum is in the Charter. So it's not just a problem of failure of secondary EU law, it's also a problem of failure of constitutional European law, since it's a right that is in Charter and it's clearly violated by the secondary European law and by the application of those laws that we are making. And another point, another question I would like to put on, it's about the agreements that were made with Turkey. Because in my point of view, those kind of agreements from one side are illegal because there is no competence of the organ that has made them. So from the point of view of the competence, these agreements are illegal. But more important even than that is that those agreements violate the principle of non-refoulement. So I cannot see how we can consider this as a solution, because looking from the law point of view, it violates international law and it also violates constitutional European law. These were the 2 points I would like to let you to think about it.
Yeah, thank you, Madam.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talks. I have a question probably more addressed to Professor Fark. I'm from Austria, and the Austrian government promotes on the EU level an initiative called Safe Lives Initiative. It's very proud of this, but it's not an original Austrian idea or concept. And it is about to tackle the problem with the death on the Mediterranean. And the idea is not inducing refugees to dare this dangerous passage, but going to the countries of origin and in combination with the UN High Commissioner or as a flying commission of the EU and picking up refugees in the countries of origin and in the regions of conflict, and then taking them to Europe. So do you think this is a good idea, or it's a workable concept? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zillard.
Remarque pour souligner ce qu'a dit Philippe Farr.
O remarcă pentru a sublinia ce a spus Philippe Farga și o autocritică. În programul nostru există, in our view, there are some deficiencies in the international law on migration. I found it very interesting that specialist in democracy warns us about several things, like the fact that the right of the migrants is not safeguarded. So it is very interesting to see that we should have legal experts agree on this point. Thank you. I need a small clarification from Professor Fark. Why do you think, Professor, that the EU does not comply with the obligations towards Turkey?
And the last word for the...
No, I mean, thanks a lot for the question. I mean, I addressed the primary law issues, and that somehow responds to both of you. If you read Article 18 of the Charter, you will see the language versions differ, but the right of asylum is respected in accordance with the Geneva Convention. So what the Charter does is more or less, it integrates the Geneva Convention into primary law, so does Article 78 TFEU. But that doesn't necessarily resolve our inquiry, because that would only be the case if we knew that EU asylum policy violated the Geneva Convention or the prohibition of refoulement in all circumstances. And indeed, we can have a discussion on whether returns to Turkey are legal under secondary and primary law. That's something I have not touched upon. And that argument can be defended, but it's not obvious, if I may say so. The Commission has put forward a number of arguments which can be defended. And even if the agreement between the EU and Turkey was illegal, that would only resolve the specific situation of EU-Turkey cooperation. But my inquiry, in a way, was more general, because the Geneva Convention may have possibly been violated in the case of Turkey, but at a more abstract level, it doesn't necessarily say that the EU can, under no circumstances, cooperate with third countries. I mean, it certainly can, the jurisprudence of international courts, I mean courts of various states from the US to Australia, is quite clear that the Geneva Convention and international refugee law does not extend a right to have a legal avenue for entry, even if that might be desirable for political or moral reasons. That's not a legal obligation under international law, and therefore states can cooperate with other states. So in a way, the argument presupposes to know the answer already, and in the case of Turkey, you may very well be right, but then again, that only resolves the case of Turkey and not the more general issue. And at a more abstract level, if I try to combine our two presentations, I agree more or less with everything which Philippe Faust says from an analytical point of view, but I'm a public lawyer, a constitutional law scholar, and as a constitutional law scholar, I want to understand why the system is as it is and how it can develop in the future. And that needs to analyze and respond to the issues, why do states, why do the European Union behave as they do? And I think it's quite telling that your argument was in essence like a moral argument, sometimes an empirical argument that we should behave differently. And that is in itself quite telling. If you go back to 1951 and if you try to analyze from an international relations perspective why states agreed on the Geneva Convention in 1951 and why they sustained a more or less generous refugee policy up until 1989, you will learn from our colleagues in the international relations field that there are underlying reasons. And one is refugee protection at the time was very much a core state interest. Refugees at the time were in European states, and not resolving the refugee issue would have undermined the stability of European states. And that was a core interest of the international community at the time, to prevent the refugee issue from destabilizing Europe. And moreover, then during the Cold War, refugee protection was an ideological weapon to prove the moral and ideological superiority of the West. And these two elements disappeared in 1989. After 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's no longer an ideological weapon to show our superiority. And refugee movement nowadays, they try to enter Europe. They are not already in Europe, so it's not so much an issue of stabilizing European states. So the core state interest in protecting refugees has disappeared. What we are left with instead, and that I think your presentation was quite representative, is a moral, a humanitarian argument that refugees should be protected. But that is then, of course, the core challenge, how to convince states and citizens to establish a legal system at the European level, and then maybe even at the international level, based on moral principles. But that's a challenge which we are not only confronted with in refugee law. Think of climate change, think of underdevelopment in sub-Saharan Africa. We know that our trading system and disadvantages African states. We know that we could easily invest a few billion euro in order to save the life of children in Africa. There is a compelling moral argument that that should be done, but it's not done. And in a way, refugee protection is precisely the same, but that's the role of a public lawyer, of a constitutional law scholar, to understand why that is the case and to highlight the legal, institutional, political, constitutional factors which lead to this outcome, which maybe morally is regrettable, but then again, that's not enough. If we want to understand why that is the case, and thereby ideally identifying trajectories along which the situation can be improved. Thank you.
Je vais donner des réponses extrêmement rapides. D'abord, à un point.
Și aș vrea foarte rapid să răspund la întrebările pe care le-ați pus. Europa, Europe, I would like to answer to what you said. First of all, Europe is different from other countries because Europe aims at long-term integration of the refugees. It is true and false in the same time. Let me go back to Iran as an example. In Iran, there are still 2 million Afghans Afghani living. Many of them, they are at the second generation now found in Iran. In the Middle East, also there are many refugees that have gone through long-term integration. And then Europe can use the legal provisions about the temporary reception of the refugees. There is not only long-time integration in place, but also short-time reception. So this is a dichotomy, and sometimes we use this dichotomy to our own benefits. And the dichotomy rests on the fact that we are not aware of what happens in other parts of the world. And as for your question, should we look for refugees in their countries of origin or in areas of conflict? I believe that in English this is called resettlement. In French, there's another word. So anyway, let's use this word, resettlement. Well, I remember, I used to live for many years in Egypt, and there were many refugees coming from Iraq back then. It was during the American occupation of Iraq. And there was such a program, a resettlement program in Egypt of the Iraqi people. But no European country was part of the program, just the USA and Canada. So this type of action that you mentioned exists, but it's little implemented. As for your question, in the European Institute in Florence, I don't know of anyone dealing with universal principles. There are experts in European laws working there. They try to see how the European law addresses refugees and migrants. As for international experts, I know nobody working there. But I know that other experts like Richard Lewinsky, and Richard Lewinsky is very much into the international law concerning refugees, but this is research done in isolation. There are no schools dealing with that. As for Europe complying with the obligations, well, the agreement signed with Turkey includes the idea of refoulement or non-refoulement. We should look closely into the contents of this agreement. What Europe does not comply with is another form of commitment. We speak of rather moral commitments or moral duties. Europe was built around the human being concept. And the migration crisis can be described simply. You are a student or somebody working on a contract, or you want to benefit from family reunification. Then you can apply for a visa in the country of origin. But suppose you are a person whose house was destroyed, whose life is threatened. What ways available are open to you? None of our embassies will grant you a visa under the circumstances, allowing you to leave your own country. The only choice is to reach the border of Europe. Thank you.
Our problem in a global context, in order to better identify the shortcomings, which you already mentioned, and also Professor Tim for identifying the challenges, especially for European and national asylum and migration law. And thank you all for the participation and questions. And we can now go to the coffee break. Thank you.